Of zit er iemand op de station?
Ik heb het ook. Alles in het eerste semester. Maandag en donderdag, maar dat zijn natuurlijk. In de tijd die wij komt.
Also ich guck mal direkt. Ja, jetzt haben wir es. Ganz große.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome. So, dear Vice Rector, dear Director of the Francqui Foundation, dear Dean, dear Laureate Tim, dear colleagues and friends. When in April 2021, the call for a new Francqui chair was sent to all department heads of our faculty, one name immediately came to my mind, Professor Tim Schwanen. The Francqui chairs are named after Emile Francqui, a Belgian diplomat, businessman and philanthropist who, together with Hubert Hoover, founded the Francqui Foundation in 1932 to support fundamental research in Belgium. The chairs are awarded to internationally renowned scientists who are invited to give a series of lectures and/or seminars to fellow researchers and students on important topics. So what is more important a topic than transport and mobility? Something that each of us experience every day. And who better than Tim to update us on how to achieve equitable and low-carbon urban mobility systems. In a series of 10 lectures, we will learn that the governance of urban transformation seems to be one of the biggest challenges of all. So I do hope that some politicians and policymakers are either in the room or have tuned in so that they can listen to what Tim has to say. Today we have the opening or inaugural lecture. Tomorrow at 10, here again in the aula, lecture number 2 and 3 on mitigation and adaptation and on knowledge and validation. In March 16th and 17th, we move from this building to the Pand for lectures number 4, 5, 6 and 7. And then finally, in April 25th, back in the aula, lectures 8 and 9, and then the final day, April 26th, in the Pand again, so we're doing a bit of mobility ourselves for the closing lecture. All details regarding the lectures given by Tim can be found on the department's website, Department of Geography. So who is Tim Schwanen? Tim Schwanen is Professor of Transport Geography and Director of the Transport Studies Unit at Oxford University. He is a geographer with a keen interest in everyday mobility of people, goods and information within and between cities in different parts of the world, including the Global South. His connection with the Department of Geography, and with me in particular, goes back a long way. There are joint research projects that have resulted in PhDs, among which Thijs Neutens and Jonas de Vos. There are also a number of joint publications, and there is obviously the Journal of Transport Geography, which Tim edited before me. I consider Tim to be one of the most influential academic thinkers in the field of transport geography. And I'm not alone. His wide range of published papers are highly cited, including his trilogy, Geographies of Transport, published in Progress in Human Geography in 2014. and he has also been invited as a keynote speaker at many different scholarly events. He received the 2018 Edward Ullman Award from the Transportation Geography Specialty Group of the Association of American Geographers for outstanding contributions to the field of transportation geography. And he also delivered the Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers plenary lecture. This was at the annual International Conference of the Royal Geographical Society with the Institute of British Geographers. And in September 2016, that was 2016, sorry. And of course now he is the Jugend Faculty of Sciences Francqui chairholder. Tim is also currently working on a new book, Rethinking Transport Geography, Transformations at a Critical Juncture. Will be published hopefully in 2023 with Edgar Elgar. Not yet completed, but already a must-read for all those interested. Before I hand over to our Dean, I would like to thank a number of people that have made this, and also the other sessions, technically and administratively possible. Nathalie Van Uffel, who helped also with the help of Cathy Strumana, Helga Vermeulen, Steven de Vrieze, Bart de Wit, Lars de Slover, and Karin van Akker, who was so helpful to step in as our, let's say, photographer. I now give the floor to Professor Isabel van Diesen, Dean of the Faculty, to welcome you all, and the chairholder in particular, and also to stress the importance of the Francqui chair for our faculty. Isabel.
Thank you, Frank. Warm welcome to you all, and specifically the Vice Rector and Professor Schwanen, thank you for joining us today. I think for many of us this is the first lecture we have in, let's say, ages here on campus, so it's very good to see you all again. It's a warm feeling to be able to be here. Now, at a time when the mobility of people, goods and information and their relation with the climate emergency, technological change, societal and spatial inequalities, and health and well-being are in the news on almost a daily basis, the Ghent University, our faculty, is proud to contribute to this with your department, many of you are here now, and with this geography department, and specifically the social and economic geography group of Professor Frank Whitlocks. This is a very important field of research, and we are happy to be able to contribute to this field today. The Faculty of Sciences is one of the 11 faculties of the university, and the faculty is very diverse. This means that researchers within this faculty focus on the study of the smallest and the largest in the universe. We study living and non-living matter. We seek knowledge at the most fundamental side of science, and we develop high-tech applications. The faculty has 13 departments, including, of course, the Department of Geography. And we know that geographers are needed everywhere. The science of geography studies the mutual interaction between society and the physical environment in a spatial context. Geographers study how human action affects the physical and socio-economic environment, and how that physical and social environment affects human action. Making the spatial context explicitly central to the analysis defines the unique character of geography. As a dean, I'm particularly proud that we in our faculty and the faculty council and the department heads have supported the vacancy for a brand new professor of transition in mobilities, this in the Department of Geography. This new professor arrives, as I understand well, in April this year. So we are happy to see this new professor dealing with the challenges of mobility, this very important topic. By doing so, the faculty recognizes the importance of mobility research, something that is also recognized at the highest administrative level of Ghent University through the so-called UBK's, and now I'm talking a little bit in Dutch. The UBK's are universiteitsbrede beleidskeuzes. We can translate this, probably not in very good English, university-wide policy choices. One such choice relates to sustainability. Ghent University wants to tackle the lead, take the lead in sustainability issues and teach its students and staff how to deal with these issues. The university wants to integrate sustainable development more explicitly in the study programs so that students are ready to face the challenges of today and tomorrow in this very important topic. UGent wants to be a leading knowledge institution for a future that is ecologically, socially, and economically sustainable within a local and global context. So we are very happy as a faculty to be able to contribute to that specific challenge. The unanimous decision of the faculty to award this year's Francqui Chair to Professor Tim Schwanen will certainly also contribute to these important objectives. The lecture series is first and foremost a must for everyone to learn, to engage and act upon, because a more just, sustainable, fair and equitable urban mobility system is really what we need in this world. Dear Professor Schwanen, dear Tim, a very warm welcome to our faculty, to our university. We look forward to your inspiring lectures. Today, the first one, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this generous welcome. Thanks in particular to Frank. Thank you to the Faculty of Science, to Ghent University, of course to the Francqui Foundation, and also to you. This is also for me the first proper lecture back in person, and it's wonderful to be here. It's also a little bit scary, and I feel a little bit rusty, but I'm sure things will improve as we go along. I came to the study of transport about 20 years ago. So I've been around for some time, but I can say with hand on my heart that it's never been more interesting to be in transport and mobility research. Transport systems are genuinely in flux, which makes them interesting in their own right, but also an important site to study broader questions in this decade. Transport is, at the moment, strongly influenced by a range of technological developments, and I will talk about them in this lecture series later on, but there's electrification, there's automation, and there is platformization. Transport is central to questions of urbanization. Urbanization is the defining trend of this century, one could say, now that most people on the planet live in cities for the first time. And transport is really central to making these cities function in a proper way. And questions of congestion are very, very central to many things that we can in those cities. Transport is also relevant to questions of public health. There's, of course, the whole question and the whole debate about air quality. There's traffic safety. There's the whole question around exposure to viruses on public transport, first and foremost. There's the question about obesity and the fact that we live in obesogenic environments dominated by cars, lifestyles that are sedentary and dominated by car use. There are questions of inequality. I will talk a lot about that in the rest of the series. But probably the most defining issue, the most existential crisis that transport systems across the world have to deal with relate to the environment, and particularly to transport and the climate emergency. There's much speculation about the future of transport. This slide, based on the work from colleagues, summarizes the main thinking quite well, at least as far as the mobility of people in cities in the global north is concerned. 3 visions: electromobility, collective transport 2.0, and low mobility society, are really very widely promulgated. Electromobility, of course, is about the widespread and fast adoption of electric vehicles in all forms of transport, so not only our cars. Collective Transport 2.0 is about the transition towards mobility as a service, often abbreviated as MaaS, in which conventional public transport, that is collective transport 1.0, is seamlessly integrating with various forms of car sharing, bike sharing, taxi services, and so on, or everything underpinned by digital platforms for booking and payment. And low mobility society is effectively about the extensive substitution of physical movement by online activity, 3D printing, and so on and so forth. And I think we can say that we've had a taste of what this future might look like during the pandemic. Now, these 3 narratives, these grand narratives, are all partial and not mutually exclusive. Indeed, the authors of the piece that I took this from are explicit about this, writing that it is only through the strong and immediate application of all 3 that the goal of sustainable mobility can be achieved. For the time being, however, transport remains deeply unsustainable. The term sustainable transport means different things to different people, but it's increasingly understood in terms of environmental sustainability, and more specifically, as transport that contributes minimally to greenhouse gas emissions. And we're quite far from that at the moment. Transport sector is the 3rd largest source of emissions globally, and currently the largest in the UK. And the most common framing of how climate change is linked to transport is through the sector's contribution to CO2, or greenhouse gas emissions. And this picture provides a really nice overview of this situation. About almost 2/3 is related to passenger transport, and then the bulk of that is road transport, but air is the fastest growing segment, and in some ways the most difficult to deal with. Freight is responsible for 40% of all emissions globally. These are rough estimates, of course, but here road also plays a large role. And it's interesting because the debate about CO2 in transport tends to focus on passenger transport. There's much less attention being paid to freight, and that is not least because of the supposed inevitability of freight transport from an economic point of view. This is a picture that shows the growth of CO2 emissions over the last 20 years or so, and basically what it shows is that pre-pandemic, the growth was phenomenal. You can see a little blip following the global financial crisis of 2007-2008. The COVID pandemic, of course, will have had a much bigger effect, and if we were to extrapolate this into to the current moment, we would see that there are big drops in 2020, but it's reasonable to expect that in the longer term, the pandemic will in itself not lead to fundamental changes in the pattern of growth. It's quite likely that in a few years, we will conclude that the pandemic has set back growth for a couple of years. That will probably be the main result. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that's where we're going. And we can see that the biggest growth is in road vehicles, particularly passengers and freight. If we look at it geographically, we see that the growth has predominantly been in Asia, followed by Africa and international aviation. Patterns are more complex for North America, for Europe, Latin America, and for international maritime, not least because of the implications of the global financial crisis. Now, we have to be very careful, and I've actually thought a lot about whether or not to include this slide, because it's very tempting to sort of assign responsibility to Asia in particular and say, well, this is where the biggest problems exist, and we're not doing that bad in Europe or North America. Well, actually, this is looking at total emissions. If you were to do this on a per capita basis, the picture would look quite differently. Yes, you would see substantial growth in Africa, in Asia still, but the per capita figures would look quite differently, and North America, and to a lesser extent Europe and Oceania, would come out as the main culprits, you could say. Now, if transport as a major contributor to the climate emergency is the dominant framing, there are others that recognize greater complexity. One of those framings is that of climate change as a special type of wicked problem. The notion of the wicked problem was originally framed by Horst Rittel in the late 1960s as a reflection on the challenges that planning and social policy were facing at the time. Rittel's view was that most problems that planners deal with are qualitatively different from those that engineers tend to deal with. Engineering problems, in his view, are relatively well defined, and in many cases there are clear solutions that can be identified with the help of well-known tactics and strategies, including optimization. Climate change as a wicked problem is a special case of this wicked problem. So it's not only the case that the problem itself is unique, that there is no definitive formulation of the problem, because the problem formulation is in many ways the problem. It's also the case that that for many people climate change is symptomatic of deeper problems. It makes a lot of difference if you think of climate change as resulting from market failure, or if you say that climate change is endemic to the way capitalism is evolving. If these two framings will lead to quite different problems as solution spaces where you're going to look for ways of dealing with the issue. So there are no clear solutions. The solutions change when the problem gets redefined. And like all wicked problems, climate change also has extensive redistributive implications for entrenched interests. Think about the fossil fuel energy, for instance, and companies like Shell increasingly presenting themselves as energy firms rather than as oil firms. In these senses, climate change is not a special type of wicked problem. But what makes it super wicked is that time is running out, that the people and actors causing the problem are also the ones who need to solve it. And there's a strong tendency to discount the future hyperbolically. So this is where behavioral economics comes in and basically says that we are very bad at sort of taking proper account of the longer-term future in our decision making. It's a little bit this comparable with people who keep eating cake without realizing that in the long term that will make them obese. It's the same type of problem. We are unable to think about the longer term consequences of our actions. There are other framings, and they don't get less bleak. Here is Isabel Stengers. I want to highlight her work, not simply because she is Belgian, though I will try to use this lecture series as an opportunity to celebrate scholarship in this country, but also and especially because her work has been a source of inspiration to me for more than 15 years. She's written many books on different topics, and she's written this little book it was published in 2015 on climate change. And she talks about climate change with the help of a metaphor that she draws from the work of James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, the concept of Gaia, which for her is a concept that tries to disrupt a habitual thinking. So here the habit is to think about climate change as a problem that can be solved. For her, Gaia is an assemblage of forces that are quite indifferent to what we as humans do. And Gaia has become angry, in her words, because of the way we've gone about abusing the planet for too long. And she writes that no future can be foreseen in which Gaia will give back to us the liberty of ignoring her. It's not a matter of a bad moment that will pass, followed by some kind of happy ending, in the sense of a problem solved. We are no longer authorized to forget her. So we're in a fundamentally new era with a new set of problems that we'll have to deal with, we'll have to learn to live with. Reflecting on these different framings of climate change, it seems to me that the transport sector faces multiple problems that force us to slow down our thinking, to use another concept from Stengers. Sure, there are the greenhouse gas emissions, and they are a massive challenge. But there is much more. We will need to learn to live with climate change and the forceful events it will cause. And we'll need to do other things. The way we think, talk, and write about transport in ways that make sense and are meaningful to others will need to change. So we'll need to reflect on the discourses that we use to make sense of transport as a part of contemporary society. As part of that, we will also need to think about the kinds of knowledge and expertise we believe we have about transport. And we need to think about what is valued in transport and therefore prioritized going forward. All of these things, in turn, are linked to and generate all kinds of inequalities. And I want to talk briefly through these elements, B through to F, in turn. This is kind of my understanding of where the academic literature is when it comes to transport and climate change. Overwhelmingly focused on mitigation. For very good reason, because of transport's contribution to the climate emergencies, the third largest source of emissions. But I think we're missing something here because we need to do much more in terms of thinking about adaptation. And one of the things I want to do in this lecture series is talk more about adaptation and think more about adaptation. I started this lecture by saying that transport systems are in flux, and they are, but that's also only one side of the story. There are many continuities in transport systems, in how we think about transport, how we research transport. So there is both change and continuity. Now these terms should not be thought of as binary opposites, but rather as a continuum. In many situations we see change folded into continuity and vice versa. And if we look at the elements on the right-hand side of this slide, we see that in some of these elements there is much more continuity. The discourses have started to shift, but haven't shifted enough. The knowledges start to change, but will need to change more. Questions of how we value transport, particularly in terms of appraisal, have not really begun to think about transport and climate change at all. It's very much the same practice of what we did decades ago. So there's quite a bit of work still to be done. And in this lecture series, I want to talk about changes and what needs to change, what I believe needs to change in all these elements here. Because there are things that keep coming back. Discourses or discursive formations, as Michel Foucault would have it, condition what can be said and known and shape relationships among actors. Discourses emerge at particular times and particular places and evolve over time and space. Key to discourses are networks of what he called statements, and their analysis allows us to understand how language in use and discursive practices condition knowledge and relationship between different actors. Now, there are multiple discourses about transport. Importantly, however, there are sets of statements that continue to prevail and dominate others. And some of these statements are shown here. And they go back to a time when transport planning and transport studies as an aspiring science faced completely different challenges to where we are today. These statements go back to the time that the whole point of transport planning was to accommodate and facilitate the growth of automobility and or manage the demand for and supply of transport in situations where problems like road congestion had emerged. Geographically, the emergence of these statements can be located in the global north, and in particular in the US, Western Europe, and Australia. On one level, the discourses and networks of statements like these are very helpful in dealing with the climate emergency because they open up particular pathways for action and intervention. On the other, they are inevitably partial. They do not tell the whole story of how mobility comes about and can be influenced. And they are actually pretty poorly equipped for thinking about significant reductions in the demand for mobility. And this has to be part of how we collectively move forward in responding to the climate emergency. The demand for mobility will have to be shrunk somehow. We don't really know how. Well, we do know ways of doing it. We don't quite know how to make them acceptable, politically and publicly, but they will have to be part of the equation. All of this is not to say that there is no discourse about reducing demand. There is, actually. And the avoid, shift, improve hierarchy shown on this slide has become the dominant way for thinking in this area. Not simply among researchers, but also at planners, among planners and professionals. And if you go to a COP conference in a transport session, you're very likely to come across this sort of set of three terms: avoid, shift, improve. Avoid is seen as the most desirable, but most difficult to reach, because it essentially is about replacing physical mobility of people, either by digital activity, telecommuting, and of course now reinvigorated because of the lockdowns during the pandemic. But avoid can also be done by changing the way cities are laid out. Higher density, mixing land uses, concentrating development around nodes in the public transport system, growth boundaries, green belts, etc., etc. All well proven and known to be effective, if only over longer time periods than we have available for thinking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a rich literature on how effective this kind of intervention is, riddled with all kinds of methodological and conceptual difficulties, and most work disregards indirect effects and unintended consequences, which we'll talk about later in this series, because I think there are some very important things to be addressed there. It's fair to say that the transport sector has been more successful in achieving shift, and actually most successful in achieving improvement. Particularly fuel economy standards have had probably the largest effect, and we're now seeing the uptake of electric vehicles, which in many ways is not a radical change at all. It's probably the most likely way in which things go forward. This avoid, shift, improve framework is quite powerful, in part because it is quite simple. But it focuses on the demand and support of transport activity. It does not consider the wider configuration within transport, within which transport or mobility is produced. So we should not only be talking about what people do and infrastructures, we should also be talking about experiences, about discourses, knowledges, valuations. Once we take the wider configuration into consideration, we will also be able to create new possibilities for other discourses, understandings, and valuations. And part of what I think we really need to do is dislodge these kinds of ideas from their status at the top of the hierarchy. It's not that these ideas are wrong. It is also not about getting rid of them. It's just about expanding the possibilities for talking and thinking about mobility if we really want to reach the level of change that is needed in order to minimize transport's contribution to climate change. So we really need to expand and intensify the possibilities to rework the hierarchies of importance I've just discussed. In other words, what we need is system change. And this diagram has been developed by Derek Loorbach and associates at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and is a very powerful visualization of what is needed. Because it is not only about cultivating the new from bottom left all the way to top right. It is also quite uncomfortably about getting rid of the old. It's about breaking down. It's just as important as building up. Now, this is a difficult message politically, but the two really go hand in hand, and we need to find ways of not only thinking about the new, but also about doing away with the old. That is still only part of the story, because there are all kinds of inequalities that cut across everything I've been talking about so far. These inequalities play out at multiple scales, from the planet to the individual body. There are multiple bases for comparison. We can talk about countries and divide them according to the Human Development Index. We can think about people or groups in terms of class, gender, race, ability, age, so on and so forth. And we can think about multiple things where these inequalities manifest. So they exist in terms of actual emissions, mileage, and use of motorized transport. And there are studies that have shown that about 20% of the people are responsible for more than 60% of all emissions in transport, so it's a highly skewed distribution. Not everyone is equally capable of reducing emissions. There are many people who are caught captive in using a car, for instance. So thinking about simply reducing car use will punish people in ways that will not be socially just. So we need to think about these kinds of things. We need to think about who is exposed to climatic events and the consequences that are caused by transport emissions. And again, to put it in very simple, crude terms, it's the poor who tend to be affected the most. So again, questions of justice come up. There are also differences in the capability to shape policy and governance, not least because not every voice counts as much, or is heard, or shouts as loud. And there are differences in the way people and different actors can shape knowledge production processes. So this is why justice, to me, is at the heart of thinking about questions of transformation, of system change in transport and mobility. And what I've done on this slide is put some of the most influential books in this space together. In many ways, it all starts with John Rawls, his analysis of the institutions that are supposed to result in fair distributions of costs and benefits, And in many ways, all the other books are responses to his claims and sort of ways of trying to critique and also advance our thinking on justice. I won't go through all of them. I will just say that some of them will pop up in later lectures as well. And one of the interesting things that I want to highlight here is the book by Schlossberg, the one in the middle, who has argued that we need to think justice in a critically pluralist manner. He argues for a pluralist conception of justice. It is not a question of one or the other as the focus of justice, but of understanding that two or more conceptions be in place simultaneously, depending on situation and context. So Schlossberg foregrounds distribution, procedural, and recognition justice. Distribution is what most people think of in relation to justice in the social sciences. It's about the distribution of benefits and the costs, harms, and risks associated with particular decisions, actions, and changes. But procedural justice is perhaps just as important, because this is about decision-making and governance. Who is able to participate, on what grounds, who is able to influence what happens. There's also recognition, because we need to not think about people or citizens in the abstract, but we need to think about differences between groups, however defined. So we need to acknowledge and respect the rights, needs, values, habits, and experiences of different individuals, different groups. You won't be surprised that this type of argument has come very much out of the various emancipatory movements that emerged in the 1960s, 70s. Second wave feminism, the gay and lesbian movement, critical race thinking, and so on and so forth. Now, this notion of justice as recognition is, in one sense, very attractive. It's also very, very difficult to operationalize and make sense of, either in a research context or in a more practical decision-making context. One way of dealing with this abstract notion is to think about different versions of justice as recognition. And there is now a body of scholarship that has looked at what is known as epistemic justice, which is about the capacity of groups and individuals to offer their knowledge and insights, and for those to be taken on board in how, for instance, science is done. To be not simply listen, but actually really change the way you practice science, you do your research, to be able to let different people make their voice heard. It's also interesting to think about questions of retribution, compensation for those suffering from past injustices, and the punishment of those responsible for that suffering. This is a shot from a series that was broadcast on Netflix in 2020. It wasn't a big success. It was meant to be multiple seasons, but they terminated it after one season. And it plays in Los Angeles in the 1930s with two police agents in the front. I think part of why it flopped was because there were simply too many storylines. But one of the interesting storylines was that there was resistance against the construction of the highways in the city. And that was particularly that those highways were cutting through the ethnic minority neighborhoods. So it was about the built-in racism in the way transport planning has been practiced. That's why I wanted to highlight it here. But it's only one example, because the history of transport planning is riddled with examples of injustice and racism. There's a classic study in science and technology studies by Langdon Winner, who has looked at some of the legacy of Robert Moses, the big planner, the famous planner in New York, who on some of the roads built bridges that were so low that buses could not go underneath them, which was a way of immobilizing the poor and racial minorities in the city. There are other examples. There's also no coincidence that Black Lives Matter started in the Bay Area, San Francisco, and is actually linked to the creation of the BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, which in transport planning circles is often hailed as an example of transit-oriented development. The story is unfortunately a little bit more complex than that. Schlossberg also argues that the second essentialist pluralist conception to keep in mind is a resistance to defining any of these conceptions in a singular, fixed way. That's a quotation from his work. His plea is for open-ended understandings of justice. So I would say that is useful, but also needs some further specification. And this is where some of the thinking of Amartya Sen, Economics Nobel Prize laureate in 1998, is useful. He is and was weary of the time and place independent nature of the attempt by people like Rawls and others following in his footsteps, and argues that a theory of justice that can serve as the basis of practical reasoning must include ways of judging how to reduce inequality and advance justice in particular settings, rather than aiming only at the characterization of what is perfectly just. So Sen's argument is we need comparative approaches to justice, and we need to be sensitive to context. I would argue that we need to think about space, perhaps because I'm a geographer, but many of these injustices work through situated spatial arrangements. And when we think about justice in a mobility context, we need to think about how transport does not operate in a silo, but is part of other social systems. And so we need to think about linkages with environmental justice, climate justice, and so on and so forth. And this is where the work of Mimi Scheller, that I've briefly shown on one of the slides, is very important. If we relate the thinking on justice to the earlier argument that system change is needed, we arrive at the need for just transformations in mobility. This is a slippery notion, and it will mean different things to different people. The origins of the term just transformation lie actually in the 1960s and 1970s labor movement in the US, where the unions demanded compensation for the closing down of economic activities for environmental reasons. So that notion of compensation and thinking about fairness is very much at the heart of what just transitions are. But beyond that, it can mean a lot of different things. And in a paper that I wrote that was published last year, I suggested we can think of a spectrum of just transformations, at least in the global north context, when it comes to mobility, where that spectrum effectively captures the degree to which the actions, interventions, and consequences differ from the mobility systems that we have at the moment. So, on one end of the spectrum, I would place status quo approaches to just transformation, where the emphasis is really on on technological substitution. Think about replacing existing cars with electric vehicles. Do not change anything of the underlying architecture or political economy, but do think about distribution, i.e. people who are worst off, try to compensate them in some way, or give them some kind of incentive to make, for instance, an EV affordable through subsidies, taxation, and so on. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is thinking about radical change, where we actively move away from automobility, where collective travel and active travel, so walking, cycling, becomes the default, not simply in European cities like Ghent, but everywhere. This will inevitably mean challenging capitalism as we know it, and it will consider distribution, procedure, and recognition to overcome the sexist, racist, ableist biases in existing and future mobility systems. I just want to sketch the spectrum. I don't want to argue for one position or the other. I just want to make clear that we can think in different ways about it. And that's what I want to do in the remainder of this lecture series. So tomorrow I will talk about mitigation and adaptation and about knowledge and valuation, sort of elaborating some of these claims about discourses that I made earlier, before the next time talk about urbanization infrastructure and about capabilities. Then turn to the role of technology, because technology is going to be very important to whatever is going to happen next. It's just not the solution. But we need to talk about electrification, we need to talk about automation, yes, we need to talk about flying taxis, we need to talk about platforms, Uber, all kinds of bike share platforms, and what have you. Before talking about the really difficult forms of mobility, flying, long-haul freight movements, and need to think about unintended consequences. I didn't mention it today, but one of the major problems is that in terms of daily mobility, we've moved. Well, it's quite well known that densification, compact cities will lead to shorter trips and more use of public transport, cycling and walking. But it is also in compact cities that the tendency to fly, for holidays for instance, is bigger. And actually there are studies that show that these two completely cancel out each other. Not all studies show that, but there are studies that have shown that. Which shows that in transport cities we work with sort of silos. We have blinds on, where we don't think about incidental trips as much as we think about the daily. So again, there's a lot of questions that we need to think about. Before ending on, as Frank was also saying, the really messy problem of how do we go forward from here? How do we govern this? For now, I want to close with these three takeaway messages. That climate change poses many challenges to transport and mobility, and that we also need to look at questions of discourse, knowledge, and valuation, among others. That justice must be placed at the heart of thinking and practice regarding deep change in transport and mobility, and that the pluralist conception of justice is imperative because the challenges in mobility transitions exceed those of distribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim, for these inspiring thoughts. We take home the three messages and we come back tomorrow to discuss further. 10 o'clock, this auditorium is the next session. I think you will have things to think about, to talk about during reception and during the lectures to come. Now I give the floor to our Vice Rector, Professor Mieke van Herwegen, who will hand over the medal and also say some words.
Thank you, Mrs. Dean. Dear Professor Schwanen, dear Director of the Francqui Foundation, colleague Pierre van Moerbeke, dear Dean, dear promoter, dear colleagues, dear audience. On behalf of the Rector of Ghent University and myself as well, I would like to thank the Francqui Foundation for giving us the opportunity to invite an outstanding international scientist to our alma mater, in recognition of his leading contributions in a truly multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary field of research, transport geography. Professor Schwanen's lecture series will make us aware of the implications of an ever-increasing demand for carbon-intensive mobility on a global scale, of the questions of whether mobility systems can adapt, of the political will to take decisive actions in the face of the climate emergency, and of the current trends that threaten to entrench, if not exacerbate, the multiple injustices embedded in urban mobility systems in and across the north, the south, and the east. We are really looking forward to your insights. We've already heard some of them tonight. Professor Schwanen, we feel both proud and deeply honored that you have been awarded the Francqui Chair 2021-2022 at the suggestion of the Faculty of Sciences. We thank you for your presence and for your, I would say, wicked introductory lecture, but with wicked, meaning wicked in a positive sense, which illustrates that it's precisely just transformations in urban mobility that we need. The past 20 years, there has been a strong cooperation between you, your group, and Professor Whitlock's research group. This collaboration has allowed us to broaden our intellectual and personal horizons and has resulted in joint research and scientific publications as well as in enduring friendships. We consider this chair as yet another result of the fruitful cooperation between your research groups and those of Ghent University. More specifically, one that seeks to bridge the gap between the acquisition and the transfer of fundamental knowledge, and that dares to think across borders in the broadest sense of the word. Professor Schwanen, today I have the privilege of presenting you with the Ghent University Medal as a token of our recognition. We sincerely hope that it may help us to keep moving in the right direction, not only in our shared past, but also in our shared future. Sincere congratulations. And now, to close the session, I have the pleasure, and this is something we haven't been able to do for a very long time, to invite you all to a reception. Yes, you heard it, a reception.
Questions can be asked during the reception.
And tomorrow, Christine.